Welcome everybody to the program. Still a few others are joining us. Let's give it another minute or two, and then we'll get started here. All right, I want to welcome all of those of you who have joined us. I know others are going to be coming in a little bit, but we have just an hour and we want to use this as effectively and fully as we can. Welcome to the second adult study class on sort of looking at the elections and some of the tasks before us as we think about the future and the messages from the election. Again, our guest is Mike McCurry, and just delighted to have him here with us. Again, I know many of you were with us last week. Some may be new, and I think you'll be able to fold right in as Mike will be talking a little differently today, more about some of the tasks that we as people of faith have in trying to help bring the country together and move forward after this divisive election. Just a word about how we'll proceed, and then I'll introduce Mike and we'll get started. Mike will, after Mike makes some opening comments, we'll have a time for discussion with him. We're in a Zoom meeting. We have a relatively modest size of a few dozen of us here, so we'll be able to talk directly with him. And if you have a question or want to make a brief comment relating to a question, you can do it one of two ways. At the bottom, you see there is a list of participants. If you click participants, later on we get to the question part. There is a function there where you can raise your hand, and you just click that, and then I can see in the list that you have a question. The other way we'll proceed is there is a chat function, which you can make comments on if you wish as we go, but you can also write in chat and I'll be monitoring it once we get into it, that you have a question about, and you can explain what it is briefly. You don't need to write it all out, or just say, I have a question, if you prefer to do that as opposed to the chat function. So we'll do that. Right now we've got everybody muted, but after Mike makes some remarks, we'll give everyone the ability to unmute themselves. We ask you to keep yourself muted unless you're asking a question, just so we don't get a lot of background noise. And again, I'll explain that again, but for now we're all muted and we'll have the opportunity to ask questions after Mike's comments. So welcome again to Mike McCurry. Again, most of us who are old enough remember Mike as very visible as the press secretary for President Clinton for 4 years. He has a long history in Democratic politics, doing press and communication in the Senate with the Democratic National Committee on more than one unsuccessful presidential campaign. And he has a long history of work. And after he left the White House, he, among other things, and continuing his consulting and work, he went and studied at Wesley Theological Seminary, and coming out of that was a relationship with Wesley, and for several years now he's been a professor there and director of the Center for Public Theology, and he continues to do his consulting with Public Strategies Washington. So welcome again, Mike. Glad to have you. Look forward to your comments and to talking with you.
Well, it's great to be back with all of you again. Those of you who are returning, and those who were, maybe new and were not with us last week. The conversation continues, and I'm thinking a little bit, it's like Groundhog Day, because I think we're at the same place we were last Saturday when we gathered together to talk. We've got a federal election that happened, a national election. It has an outcome which has been broadly declared now. It was right on the verge of being declared when we were together last Saturday. And we clearly have a nation that's very, very divided. It's 75 million votes for Biden, 70 million votes for Donald Trump. That is not the picture of a nation that has got kind of an overwhelming desire to move in a certain direction. So we're in that kind of unstable category right now. And of course, we've seen in the last week controversies about, well, what is the transition going to be? And how do we make a transition? And who has what responsibility? And a lot of contentiousness around that. So, even though Biden has been declared the winner, he is not formally the winner until the Electoral College meets, and there's even a lot of mischief going around about that. But the one thing that is certain is that the process of transition has been going forward. Now, I happen to be pretty good friends with Ron Klain, who's now been named as the chief of staff to the incoming president, or we will stipulate that he is declared the incoming president. And Ron is a very, very good guy. I've worked with him on a lot of things, debates. I've taught in his course at Georgetown on several occasions. And that's the kind of quality person that gives us some confidence that we've got some continuity and stability that will help us move forward with, the results of the recent election. Now, for those of you who were there last week, we went over some of the election results, and I don't want to dwell on that, but I do think, a couple of things stand out to me, that there are still, very great divisions and polarization in the American electorate, and not great unanimity about the best direction for the country to move ahead. And that means we've got a particular challenge in thinking through, what we're going to talk about tonight, the role of the church, and where does the church play some role in this conversation, which is the main purpose of our discussion tonight. But it is a time when a lot of people are very, very nervous and worried about how our institutions of government are going to function. And will we make it through this period? And will we emerge on the other side in a better place? And that kind of, some of that hangs in the balance right now. So it's a time of, I assume maybe a lot of people on this call feel a little nervous and maybe feel anxious about that. And you should, because I think it is a period of some anxiety. And what I want to talk about tonight is how can the church address that kind of anxiety? There are a couple of resources. We didn't get this circulated to everyone on the call participating, but the Washington Post last week, November 8th, in the Washington Post magazine had a wonderful article, God Save America, written by the editor of the magazine. And that I would recommend that if you can kind of go fish that out of your recycling bin and take a look at that, because it really goes to the heart of this subject about how do politics and religion mix, and should they? And he makes a case that's saying, yes, they should, because there's something positive that the world of the faith community can bring to our political discourse at this time. And that's not something that is, often easily digested by the American people. But I think that's a very, very important piece to take a look at. The other thing is, for those of you who are Washington Post subscribers, today they always have the religion page on Saturday. They get one page in the B section of the Metro section where they talk about religion. But they had a fascinating article today about some of the people who are, going to be involved in what is generally called the faith advocacy effort work at the White House. Now, there's a long history to that. It actually goes back to George W. Bush. It was not Bill Clinton that invented this. But we have had in the White House, in recent White Houses, someone who's actually engaged with the faith community and drawing them into some of the discussions of issues that we face in the public square. And I think the importance of that role will grow in the Biden administration, but there's a great article today about some of the people who might be engaged in that effort. So I would really encourage everyone, if you've got your Washington Post still hanging around today, to take a look at that article. I think it's on B2 of the Metro section. So the discussion goes on, and the discussion is really about what is the role of the faith community as it relates and interacts with the political community. And so I think we start with one question, which is that even an appropriate discussion to have? Now, some of you last week remember I talked about this idea of separation of church and state, which is always kind of thrown back of saying, look, we don't talk about politics in the church. We have separation of church and state. We don't do that. But the history of that is very, very important to understand, because it would come, the idea of separation comes from the letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, which I think I mentioned last week, in which he said there should always be a wall of separation between this new constitutional government that we're forming and organized religion. And it was to really make it very, very clear that we were not going to have established religion in the United States the way they did in Great Britain. That, frankly, that was one of the ways in which we kind of defined ourselves, and it created our identity as a nation that was not going to be run by a queen or someone who was, given some kind of church title that was going to be in charge of us. And that was a very important principle. It was also, the other big contributor to that was James Madison, who objected in the Virginia State Assembly to raising taxes on people to give support to churches. His great essay about remonstrances is one that is kind of also fundamental in understanding what this idea of separation of church and state is. But at the same time, even though there was a very clear tradition that we would not have established religion, there was also simultaneously a very clear tradition that the religious faith community would play a role in the politics of the emerging nation. So there was a lot that went into how do people of faith express themselves, and what is the role of people who go to worship on Sundays, then play in what we call the public square, what is going on in the political life of the nation. And they were simultaneous, and they were intertwined in an important way that we, I think, don't always understand, that as much as we had kind of this separation of church and state, we simultaneously had a very clear involvement by religious people of deep faith in the work that the new nation was going to do. And so that was, kind of a premise that we went through. So what is that tradition? Well, we've seen it play out in a lot of ways in different times in the recent life of our nation. We've clearly seen the church involved in areas of social life. The church, and by the way, when I say the church, I'm being very ecumenical there, because I think we obviously have many faith traditions, many different expressions of that, but we're talking about really communities of faith and the people who actually are engaged in that kind of work. But what is that tradition? Well, the church, take a look at some issues that the church has been actively engaged in. Prohibition, alcohol use, the fight for abstinence, clearly one. The church's role in abolitionism and fighting slavery and being, really a moral force against what some have called America's original sin, slavery. So, the church playing a very active role in that. In my time, more recently, the church involved in the anti-war movement. When I was a kid going to youth group in my church in California, we were actively engaged in the anti-war protests related to the Vietnam War, and the church clearly played a very important role of that. And then obviously in the civil rights struggle, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the role the church played in fighting for civil rights for Americans. The church has kind of always been engaged and playing a role, but understanding that role and what the limits were and what it really meant was, I think, one of the things that kind of define some of the questions that we have when we look at this issue of religion and politics. Now, faith leaders, as I would suggest, have played an important role, but how can it be used effectively? So I think that's a question that we should turn to in our discussion today. First, we've got denominations, and we are all part of a denomination one way or another, or even if we are in non-affiliated churches, we've got faith communities that are playing some active role in the public square. In my church, the United Methodist Church, we have the Board of Church and Society in this great building, which maybe some of you have been to before, the United Methodist building right next door to the Supreme Court, right on Capitol Hill. And it's chock-a-block full of groups that are doing a lot of work in the faith advocacy area and make a very, very big difference. You've got then nearby the Presbyterian Church of the USA, which has got its own Office of Public Witness, which also does similar kind of work. You've got various groups affiliated with the Catholic Church and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which are very active on Capitol Hill. And you've got the National Council of Churches, which is also nearby there on Capitol Hill. So you've got at least some expression of denominations in the mainstream church that think it is important for us to be actively engaged in the work that happens on Capitol Hill, the work of our Congress, obviously. And then they are involved in, obviously, all the other things that happen in the federal government. So my point here is there is a tradition of the denominational church being fully engaged in a lot of the national debates that we have. And it's not been a surprise that they've been involved in, different kinds of controversies over many, many years. And I think, recognizing that and appreciating that role, if you do, or wondering about it, I think that's where the conversation begins. Is that the right place for the church to be? Should we be involved in these political conversations? From time to time, I get people who come up to me and sort of say, well, I don't come to church to hear politics discussed. And I always kind of push back a little bit on that and say, well, this is the place where we need to have those conversations. And I want to walk through some ways in which I think we can effectively do that. First, what is the setting in which we have these conversations in the local church? I think this is important. Churches tend now to be fairly homogeneous in the way in which they reflect the population that they live in. Like my congregation, a liberal progressive church in Montgomery County in Maryland, I'm reasonably certain that about 80% of the people probably have a political perspective that is not unlike mine. So we have in the mainstream church more liberal progressive churches that have got that point of view. We have obviously evangelical churches that are much more conservative and appeal to people who've got more of a conservative political view. We also have, and I think it's important to recognize, increasing, we've got an African American church that is very socially progressive, but sometimes very religiously orthodox. And we have a Latino church, which is increasingly important, that also has people who have fled from tyranny and from authoritarianism, who come here and are looking for a much more vibrant way to express their faith that is consistent with where they have come from. So we've this diversity, this tapestry of the different ways in which we reflect our faith values and the way in which we address issues in the public square is pretty fascinating. And it's very complex. It's not, there's no way in which you can kind of universally describe the way in which different congregations respond to these issues. So I think about all of you in your church. You might sit next to someone in the pew who, most of the time you basically agree with what they have to say, but then you would suddenly be startled to hear them say something about current politics that was a surprise to you. It might not happen inside the church, and I want to get to that in a minute or two. It might happen if you're having conversations in the coffee hour, if you're talking afterwards. But that engagement, that discussion, is something that sometimes produces a very, very interesting result. And I think that's important. I think it's important that we foster that and that we do that. I'll tell you about one experience that I had at my local Methodist church. I live, by the way, right across the street from our Methodist church, where my wife and I have attended with our kids for a long time. So we can never duck out on Sunday morning because everyone sort of sees whether we were there or not. But in my time at the White House, when I went there, particularly during the years of L'Affaire Monique, during the years of the Monica Lewinsky episode, there were so many of the members of my congregation that were shy about raising any issues with me. I think they wanted to leave me alone. They figured, well, this poor guy deals with this all week long, so he just wants to be here and be quiet. And part of me, that part of that was true. I mean, I enjoyed having that safe sanctuary to go to kind of deal with my own stuff during the week. But at the same time, I wish there had been more people who would sort of come up to me and say, well, what's really going on? What's really happening? Some did. They were sometimes a little furtive about raising those kinds of issues. But I think there was, you could sense this desire that we need to talk these things through. And, some of them felt almost like, well, it's inappropriate for me to ask about, what's going on at the White House or what's going on in politics here in church. We shouldn't be having those kinds of conversations here in church. And as I've done my work over the years, that's the attitude that I want to attack a little bit, because I think the church has got to be the place where we have these kinds of conversations and think about rebuilding some sense of what the common good is. How do we have civil dialogue? If we're not going to have civil dialogue in a place like a church, then, where are we going to have those kinds of dialogues? We're not going to see it on cable television. We're not going to see it in many of our other public institutions. So we need to kind of create safe spaces for this kind of dialogue. And that requires, some real effort. And let me, raise a few points on this. First, and this is not directed to anyone at your church, but we have got to have preachers who are not shy about talking about important public issues from the pulpit. We've got to hear more sermons that are directed at some of these issues that are very important. We have to have preachers who will respect the fact that some people will disagree, and we have to have formats within churches in which there can be dialogue after a firebranding sermon, in which there can be some discussion, and people who've got different points of view feel like their point of view is respected. Very few churches do that. Most preachers flee the other direction. when we're talking about politics and public affairs, because they know if you enter into that kind of controversy, you're going to have people who disagree. And, mostly we try to create harmony and unity within the body of Christ. But we need some people who will hold us accountable for important values, moral principles that count, particularly in the kind of contentious time that we're in now. I also think that we need to address these issues in terms of church governance. Making these discussions part of the way in which we run our churches is important. I'm not a Presbyterian, but I would suggest every time the session meets, there ought to be an agenda item that says public affairs. What are we doing to address the issues at either the federal level, the state level, the community level that need our attention as the body of Christ? What should we be doing? So it ought to be routinely worked into the way in which the church operates and does its business. That is not an easy thing to do, believe me. I mean, I've tried to do this in my own church, and people, have some objections to that, say, well, I don't want to talk politics in church. But if we don't talk politics and the issues that are important in the public square in church, where is a better place that we are going to do that? Because there aren't that many places where, as I say, we have a safe sanctuary to do that kind of work. So I will look at my clock here. I want to just give, how would you do this? What's required to have an effective engagement strategy for how you would do this if you're a local church or even in your own individual work? So I've got here 5 C's for effective engagement. Now you can write these down. This might make you qualified to be White House press secretary someday, so I don't suggest that as a job vocation for anyone. But here are 5 C's that I would recommend. The first C is credibility. There is so much uncertainty about who's telling the truth and who we can really trust and where do we get our factual information. The best that we all can do is to always be seen as an authentic communicator of truth. Now, every pastor knows that because we have the gospel truth that pastors can communicate. But I think not being seen as someone who is just a spin doctor, which I personally have been accused of being from time to time, but as someone who shoots straight and tells the truth and who you can rely upon for factual information that is important. I think that's the number one thing that we have to protect, both in our personal reputations and in the reputations of our congregation and our churches, that we are seen as a body of Christ that really always tells the truth. The second would be candor. So the second C is candor. We have to admit when we screw it up. And there have been times in which we have not done a good job at this, and when we've strayed and when we've made mistakes. And it is very, very hard for organizations to admit to making mistakes because they don't want to be held liable legally. They don't want to, they want to get into places where they feel like they're being contested. But I think finding the ways in which we admit that we have not told the truth is a very, very hard thing. Just look at the headlines from the last 2 weeks or so, and you get pretty good examples of that. So, how do you develop the candor necessary to acknowledge wrongdoing and to admit that you're going to do something about it? Okay, the third C is clarity. We've got to be so much more clear about what we're communicating. There's so much noise in the atmosphere that having a powerful, strong message that breaks through all the clutter is very important. Now, maybe it will astonish some of you, but I will cite Donald Trump as having a very good, a good example of this. Make America Great Again was not just a slogan. It was a way in which he kind of organized a whole presentation that he made during his politics that I think did resonate. I mean, there's nobody in this country that doesn't understand what Make America Great Again meant in terms that Trump defined it. So what is our slogan? What are we going to put on our red caps? How do we communicate something that is really powerful and breaks through the clutter? Because I think that is very, very important to do. My fourth C is compassion. We have got to find better ways to listen and hear people who disagree with us, and to be respectful of their dignity and their integrity, and find ways to communicate in which we don't immediately try to kind of cross over them and obliterate whatever argument that they have. And I think part of that is to establish what I would call the golden rule of politics, which is treat your opponent the way you would wish yourself to be treated. So if you're in a political debate, if you're in a conversation, you have to be able to say, I understand and hear what you're saying, and I love you like my neighbor, and I will hear you and listen to you. And by the way, a technique for that is if you can repeat to someone that you disagree with what their argument is, and do it authentically with some genuine respect for whatever they're saying, even if you disagree, then they know that you've listened to them, that you've been heard. And I think that's a technique that we ought to try to develop and work hard at. And then my fifth C here that I have is commitment. It's actually perseverance, but that would be a P, so I wouldn't have 5 C's. But it's the commitment to work at this, because this is hard work. This is not easy for any congregation to do. It's not easy for any denomination to do. I think we collectively need to think about how do we invest resources and time and work in our congregations at trying to get these conversations right. But at the end, what I'd say to kind of wind up here is that there is so much dysfunction and disorder in our political body that we in the body of Christ need to bring some harmony back into the equation, because we have something that's on our side, which is love. And we know that if we love thy neighbor as thyself, then that requires of us certain kinds of behavior in politics and in our discussions that we don't often see right now. And we can model that kind of behavior and make a big difference. And so at the end of the day, I sort of say, yes, churches need to be fully engaged in the work that we're doing in public affairs and in our politics and in our system of governance. And we need to do it respectfully. We need to do it consistent with the traditions of our Constitution and the way in which we've, looked at religion and the role of our public life. But it is urgent work. And now more than ever, I hope that we can all be engaged in that work. And we have that moment, hopefully, of transformation coming very soon, very early next year. So with that, I throw it back to you all. And
Yeah.
Theo, I think you had some questions lingering from last week too, that I know you sent me.
Yes, and I just invite, I think in a minute, we're going to give you the potential to unmute, but don't unmute until we call on you. But if you have a question, raise your hand either in the participants section or make a comment in chat, as one or two have done that. There is a question Janine McKay put in chat, and it was somewhat similar last week, so maybe we start with that. She raised a question about particularly some of the more conservative evangelical churches, and they may have one issue, say abortion is the most preeminent or something, where it seems to override everything, and makes it very hard to work with folks because they're so adamant about it, and they choose politicians. Do you have thoughts about that? And are there ways to find common ground, even if we have disagreements on core issues like that?
Well, I mean, that is an issue that we've struggled with for a long time now. And I don't discount the idea that if someone believes that abortion is murder, then they have a moral obligation to rise up and stand against it and to do everything they can to prevent it from happening. And I think I fully understand where folks like that are coming from, because they think it's a moral evil that they need to strenuously object to, even to the point of, making accommodations for someone like Donald Trump, only because they think that he will carry that agenda and be forceful in seeking to end what they believe is a moral abomination. So, I mean, that's that side. The other side is that those of us who respect a woman's right to choose, and that this should be a decision that a woman makes with consultation from whoever she seeks advice from, that we should not have the government or law litigate and impose certain solutions. So, what do? I mean, you try to find a formulation during the Clinton years. I don't want to go back, that's ancient history for some of the people on the call, but we really, the formula that Clinton had, which is abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. I would turn that around now in my own mind and say, I want it to be rare, but safe and legal. And how do you make it rare? Well, there are ways in which you could advance government programs that would help and make a real difference. But those are defining issues for a lot of people. They're defining issues because they are matters of moral principle. And I think, for those of us who sort of we object to, there's just a one issue view of this, and that's all they care about. Well, they care about it because it's something very important to them. And we have to have some respect for that and have the integrity to listen and hear to what they're saying, even if we take a different view.
I invite you, if you have a question, to click the raise hand function or to type something in chat. Let me just pick up on one or two other things, Mike, from last week, as we're kind of waiting for others who might have questions. There were a couple of questions about if we desire to bridge divide, but we're again dealing with folks that had perceived where issues around race or racism have not been dealt with. And so many of the divides seem to be coming from how we think about our history and we think about race. How do we begin to have a conversation if that's there and people maybe feel even they're being dehumanized by the other side because of their attitudes about it? So, and again, I think this 5 C's apply in a certain way, compassion and all of that, but have you had experience, or do you have a sense of particularly how do we address this racist history in the dialogues we need to be having?
Well, the first is that we've got to have genuine conversation with those in completely different circumstances. I'll give you an example here in my local church. We're in Lily White, Kensington, Maryland, but we've reached out to the almost all African-American Baptist church that's just across the way in Connecticut, from Connecticut Avenue, and begun some dialogue around these issues. So I think it starts with building real relationships. And that, there are a lot of churches that have their social justice Sundays and talk about issues of race, but there are not many that actually go down the street to the African American Baptist Church and say, let's do some work together. Let's think of some community projects. Let's engage with each other. So I think part of it starts with building that kind of relationship that actually brings people together so that they build across some of these divides, because they are very, very real. And they, we all know this. We all know that, we probably don't have that many friends or close confidants or folks that we engage with who are from a different walk of life than where we are. So, I would think, how do you create mechanisms to make that happen? How do we create mechanisms to bring people together for common endeavors that will help communities? I think if we could spend a lot more time designing those kinds of mechanisms, I think we'd be better off.
One final one here that was raised during the week, and someone pointed out a nice article by Michelle Norris in the Post this week.
Yep.
Where she says, yeah, reconciliation is fine, but maybe not yet. Does the other side even want to do this? She used the phrase, we don't watch out, it's like bringing an olive branch to a knife fight. I don't know, do you perceive there are ways in, obviously with hardcore supporters maybe on the Trump side, no, but are there ways in to have these conversations about reconciliation, or are they not ready? Is the country not ready for that? Yeah.
Well, that has to be done individually and not institutionally. I remember once we had Hillary Clinton was at an event that I hosted, and I asked her, I said, why is the U.S., she was in the Senate at the time, I said, why is this U.S. Senate so screwed up? And her answer was, because we really don't know each other that well. We don't have relationships of trust. And she and a number of other senators, and I think a number of them now, are trying to sort of, how do we build individual relationships where we trust and expose ourselves to what some of our biases are and what some of our grievances are, and frankly, what some of our true thoughts are. What do we, how much do we hide behind the veil of trying to be nice, liberal, progressive people who are very accommodating, when in the back of our minds saying, we don't like being, we don't like smart ass black kids giving us a hard time on the metro, just as an example. And there are people who feel that way. I mean, I'll confess, sometimes I feel that way. But we've got to break that down somehow or other by having different ways in which we attack some of those cultural things that really separate us and make us make us doubt our ability to bring the country together, because otherwise we just kind of go into our individuated silos. Now, the other thing I had not mentioned yet, but we need to encourage and require much more expansive understanding of political content and literature, because it's so easy for us to just kind of get stuck in the silos that we're in. So we're only listening to the same echo chamber that we are always in. So how do we encourage particularly students who are coming along to be more magnanimous in the way in which they look at different kinds of content and bring different points of view in and find reasonable ways to discuss them? By the way, I'm working on, I do a lot of work with a thing called the News Literacy Project that is really trying to develop that kind of curriculum at the high school level, so that people really so high school kids understand, what are you looking at on the internet? And what are you looking at in social media? And what is a valuable source of content for you that will help you actually have enough factual information to form your own opinion? And it's not just the mainstream media. I'm not saying everybody has to go read the New York Times every day, but there are ways in which we could actually help people understand what is it to be a more literate citizen in our democracy. And I think we need to encourage that sense of civic duty and civics, which is not a topic that is taught anymore in high school, as near as I can tell. But what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States, and what are your civic responsibilities and duties? I mean, I think that's all a part of the work.
See any hands up, but there are a couple of comments that have come in, and I can mention them if the people who mention them also want to chime in.
I did a shout out to the Office of Public Witness at the Presbyterian Church earlier, and I saw on the Zoom thing that Kyle might be on the call. And I'm not sure Kyle's one of my students. I'm not sure if he's still
good.
working.
No, he did. And Kyle had a question. He was one of the ones. So Kyle, if you want to articulate this, is Kyle work at Office of Public Witness? Kyle, do you work at the office?
I don't anymore, but
yeah, good. Yeah, go ahead and make your comment or mention your question. Yeah, thanks.
It's good to be with you, and I was lucky to have you as a professor now 6 years ago. So when I was working at the Office of Public Witness. So thanks for that shout out. And I think there are a lot of great organizations working at the United Methodist Building, as you noted. I guess my question is kind of, and I'm maybe a bit more cynical in some regards. I think a lot of the accusations of churches being too political really get down to being too partisan, and being partisan in a way that the people making the accusations are not. So I guess, how do you respond when I think that the questions or the critiques you get aren't that a church is too political, but that they're too partisan, and in the reality that many of the issues that we work on in ways will be more closely aligned to one party or one candidate. And I think people that make the accusations might tend to align or work on issues that are more closely attached to the other candidate or the other party.
Well, terrific question from one of my best students ever. But I see this played out in my church, the United Methodist Church. We have great divisions. In fact, the church is probably headed towards some kind of schism around issues of human sexuality, not particularly partisan issues, but it is infused with that kind of partisan flavor because the Methodist Church is broad, expansive. I mean, not too unlike the Presbyterian Church in America, but it represents all flavors. But we have seen the polarization in our politics creep into the church itself. So we've got, parts of our church that are clearly much more conservative politically, and clearly some that are much more active in progressive politics. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. It's important for the church to be there and to be accountable and responsible in speaking authentically to the issues that matter. But it would be grievous for the church to become partisan and to become aligned with certain political points of view. Now, I think some conservatives could argue, well, you liberals in the mainstream church, you went all Democratic in the 1960s. You went all in for the Civil Rights Act, and you became all very political. And then those on the other side would say, well, then you conservatives went all in with the moral majority and became, adjuncts to the conservative movement into the 1980s. And part of it is, I don't object to people having strong political views that grow out of their faith convictions. But I obviously would never want churches to become aligned with political parties or political campaigns or political divisions. Now, this happens. I mean, and it happens, and we have to be honest about this. It happens on the Sunday before election in African American churches, here's the ballot sheet that you get. I'm sure it happens in conservative churches where there's, direct political appeals. Now that happens to all be against the law, among other things, but how to figure out how to modulate that and really draw the bright lines between partisan political activity and engagement in the public square. I think that's where we need to do a lot more work. What what's the proper rule? We don't, you know, we have, I mean, there are churches that sponsor candidate nights and invite people to come in, you know, invite candidates to come in and present points of view. And sometimes that skews to one political point of view or another. So I think we've got to be very, very careful about that. And we got to, you know, begin to define some, you know, very clear distinctions between what it means to be engaged in the public square versus being a vehicle for partisan political activity. And we have not, you know, we have not wrestled with that very clearly. I mean, we've, you know, it's an issue that kind of bubbles up from time to time, but it has not been, you know, I think first and foremost on the minds of people who are running our denominations or really thinking through this. And then, you know we've got examples of religious leaders who are very clearly very partisan in the way in which they present their views to a public and make overt calls to support one candidate or another. And I think that needs to be challenged, and there ought to be some enforcement of restrictions against that by, you know, the IRS that grants tax exemptions to a lot of these institutions. So I think there's a way to clear this up, but I think it has to be done very, very carefully so that we preserve the ability of people to have some fundamental expression of religious freedom, so that they can, you know, they can feel free from a point of faith to express what they believe, but keep that clear from what then happens in the realm of political campaigning and national elections. And I think that's where we have too much fuzziness in that category right now. And I think we need to do more work to clear that up.
There's a comment in the chat that leads to I think a question, maybe a comment about importance of coalitions and people of faith working with different folks. And Gary Waring from Luther Place cites a couple of things in DC. And I guess I'd like to take that and ask you, are there, given the polarization in the church and in the faith community, are there issues that you think have a greater potential for us to maybe work, we are in the more progressive side, to work with more conservatives? You know, are there, is climate change or immigration, or are there some issues where we might find broad common cause with some of the folks who voted, say, for President Trump?
Yeah, well, you hit on exactly the right answers there. Especially when I talk to younger folk from different sides of the political equation, the unanimous view that we have really done a lousy job of dealing with the urgent issues of climate change. And what we have to do is a motivating factor for young people, right and left. I mean, you could go to any different kind of youth group from different political flavors and say that they really care about this because they understand that this is a proximate concern of them. Immigration, which you mentioned, is a little more dicey because accepting the other and embracing people who come, I think there's a lot of unanimity within, you know, faith communities that we should not penalize children and separate them from mothers because we've got some immigration issues. I think there is some prospect there. The other issue I would cite is income inequality and the fact that we still have so many people who face food insecurity. I do a lot of work in the hunger relief area and support for programs like SNAP and making sure that kids have got, you know, at least a breakfast and a lunch and maybe an after-school snack that keep them alive when they may not have any prospect at home. This is an urgent issue because we've got kids who are now, and it looks like, may be confined to being homeschooled because their schools are not going to be able to be open, which is the primary way in which, you know, they get their meals every day. So we got to work through those issues. But that is an issue, again, where there's no right and left on the issue of a kid being hungry. how in this country could we allow children to go hungry and to face food insecurity? That's a complicated issue. It's poverty. It's a lot of other things that go into that equation. But that's exactly that to me is exactly where the church should be. We should be in the middle of all of those kinds of issues, and that is not partisan in any way, shape, or form.
And you seem to feel there is potential for building more bridges on some of those issues than we may think at first glance.
Yeah, there it is. It definitely is more potential in that. And frankly, it's if older people who are in the church governance systems and in our polity step aside and let younger people take over leadership. I mean, younger people, I've got kids who are, in the late 20s, and they just they're astonished sometimes at how wound up we get on certain issues when they think it's all pretty pragmatic. And they are, they're not ideologically driven. They basically just want to say, we should be taking care of our friends. We should be doing the right thing in our communities. We should be seeking a common good. And, they're all about that. I think part of it is like, will we baby boomers get out of the way and let them, go do what I think they're capable of doing?
One other thing I've heard some young people of Focus say is focus more on the local area, that there may be a way to organize and find commonality more in communities than we can in the Congress, and you comment on that, or is that another, as we look for ways to work together when we're stuck, we got to look for other areas. Maybe the local is a way to do that.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, I have found the most rewarding stuff I do with my wife is we, work in a local food delivery program for one of our local elementary schools here in Montgomery County, Maryland. I mean, that is much more satisfying to me than anything I ever did in national politics. Much more satisfying than anything I ever did at the White House, to be sure. So I do think finding the way in which you make a difference at the community level is part of the answer here. And I think, I'm not saying that we should disregard or discount important national issues that are going to be on the agenda, but, to be honest with you, I mean, I don't want to sound cynical or pessimistic here, but Joe Biden with Mitch McConnell as a majority leader in the Senate, they ain't going to get a lot of big legislative acts done over the next 4 years. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So what do you do to make a difference? Well, I think Biden does have an opportunity because he can bring some. I'm sorry that my bird clock is going off. If you hear that in there.
I have one too, so I understand. Go ahead. Thanks, Mike.
But, so I doubt that we're going to see major federal legislative efforts that make much progress. But it is important that we bring in a cadre of people who are committed to doing the common good and who will serve the nation well. And I think that Biden's great opportunity here, and it will be difficult because he's got to get a cabinet confirmed, which is not going to be easy to do, but he can, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of important jobs in the federal government that can be filled with people who've got a different perspective. And I think that's the big change that's coming, is that we're going to get a whole new cadre of people involved and engaged in the national work that our government does. And I think that will be hopeful. I mean, it will be hopeful to me, not from a political point of view, but I just think we're going to have a level of competence that will begin to rise again. And I think that will be a good thing.
Good. Well, thank you. And given that we're at time, we'll make that the last comment. Appreciate your guidance and as we think about how to navigate. And one thing I hear is we may have to be creative and try some slightly different directions and make sure we don't get stuck imprisoned in our own vision of our silo. Maybe look for ways we can connect beyond.
But we need churches to do the kind of dialogue that we've had the last 2 Saturdays, and to be engaged in these issues and to be involved. And, you know, I've got more work to do that at a seminary, training young people who are going to go out to serve our church to be equipped to do that. But I think all of us need to be engaged in how can the church make a difference, because they need us. Our country needs us. So.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for your participation and attention and questions and all. We do have recordings of both programs, and we're going to send them out to the people we're aware of who came and participated, so others can join us in thinking about some of these issues.
And Theo, try to send, if you can get the link to that.
Send around the link at the same time.
Washington
We'll do
Post.
that. So that
Right.
good suggestion. The name of it again is
God in America. God
Yeah.
Save America, and
Yeah.
it was written by Richard Just, and it was in last Sunday's.
good. We'll make a
Washington
point to
Post.
send that link along with the recording links for this. Again, thank you, everybody. Thanks so much. Thank you,
Thanks.
Mike.
Bye-bye.